Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on disaster preparedness policies and drills, presented by our sponsor, Heffernan. We're so happy you can join us. My name is Deb Beto, and I will be your moderator today and be monitoring questions you may have during the session. Before we open up the session, let's review a couple of key items. All of the webinar materials we discussed can be found at the URL that is currently on your screen. I will be sharing this URL in a follow-up email, so don't feel like you need to write it down right now. If you have trouble with your internet connection during the webinar, we recommend leaving the presentation and logging back in. If you have audio difficulties or a telephone line goes dead during the call, hang up and call back again to the same number. If all lines go dead, watch the on-screen chat box for an alternative call-in number. Please feel free to ask questions or provide feedback by using the chat box or questions box during the webinar. If you are using a tablet, you may need to tap on the screen for the options bar to appear, and then you can select the appropriate option. We may not respond immediately, but we will work your questions or feedback into the presentation. If we can't get to your comment or question during the session, we will be online afterwards to respond, or we may follow up in an email if we run completely out of time. You may also email us at moderator@aspenrmg.com for up to 48 hours after the webinar. This will be a 1-hour presentation. Questions and comments are very much encouraged throughout, and the presenters will be answering questions at the end. And lastly, we have a number of webinars upcoming covering a variety of topics, including those listed at the Heffernan webinar website. In addition, we offer the mandatory preventing harassment training in English 3 times a year. With that, let's begin today's webinar, Disaster Preparedness Policies and Drills. Today's interactive session will be facilitated by Ed Langmaid. Ed Langmaid is a retired Director of Business Continuity and Safety from BAE Systems in San Diego. He was responsible for occupational safety and health programs for 20-plus sites from 1980 to 2000. Promoted to Director of Public Affairs and Community Relations from 2000 to 2006, then to Director of Business Continuity and Safety until retirement in 2008. Ed, currently a managing consultant for Aspen Risk Management Systems, is supporting business continuity and safety, health, and environmental opportunities. In addition to his civilian career, Ed served 20-plus years in the United States Navy and Navy Reserves, retiring as a Naval Intelligence Officer. His education includes degrees in occupational safety and health management and business management. Ed volunteers as a member of CERT, which is the Community Emergency Response Team, and InfraGard, an FBI-sponsored organization dedicated to sharing information and intelligence with businesses to prevent hostile acts against the U.S. It's my pleasure to turn the presentation over to Ed Langmaid. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Deb. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. One item that we need to cover is the content disclaimer. You can read this now or when you get the copy, a soft copy, after the webinar. We're going to start off this morning with a polling question. This way we get an idea of who's online, and maybe I can modify some of my examples accordingly. Are you there, Deb? Hello, Deb. Do you have the results? If anyone can hear me, we are currently experiencing some technical difficulties. Please stand by.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
Okay, sorry about that. There was some technical difficulties with my line for some reason that I got kicked off. So I think we're back on track. So let me go back to the answer of the polling question, which is that 20% said manufacturing, 26% said office personnel, 1% construction, and 53% said other. So I apologize for that technical difficulty. It doesn't normally happen with my line, but obviously it's the subject matter that we have today. So sorry about that, everyone.
We're having a disaster, but that's okay. I just I'm glad it was you and that I had not unplugged by accident, and everyone was calling out for me and not hearing me. So I think we're ready to go on then. Thank you very much for that information.
Okay, you should be ready to go forward, Ed.
Okay, great. Wonderful. Well, there's always a risk of a disaster. There are very few parts of the country where there's no threat of a natural disaster, and man-made disasters can occur anywhere. Today's webinar will cover disaster preparedness, policies, and drills. We will discuss how you and your company will recover from the disaster it had yesterday. Our mock disaster occurred yesterday right after normal working hours. It doesn't matter what type of disaster. All disasters will result in an impact to you, your family, other employees, and the company. Even if you're not on the leadership team of your company, you will play a significant role in the days and weeks following a disaster, especially if you have a family. Your time, energy, and thoughts will conflict between work and home responsibilities. Let me repeat this for emphasis. Your time, energy, and thoughts will conflict between work and home responsibilities, and you will not be effective when you are conflicted between work and home. In our mock disaster, you and everyone else did what they could after the mock disaster occurred last night. You decided on the immediate actions to take. We will discuss details of those actions towards the end of the webinar. Let's do a polling question, Deb.
Excellent. So our next polling question. Which of these disasters will cause the most harm to your company? Is it flood or fire in the building, flu pandemic, workplace violence, or earthquake, hurricane, or tornado? So this is either going to be a local disaster, a national disaster, or a regional disaster. And everybody is busy voting here, Ed, and while they're doing that, I'd like to encourage people to go ahead and use your questions or chat box to answer or to ask questions along the way that we can answer for you. Okay, so we've got a good percentage of people that voted. So Ed, 28% say flood or fire in the building, 3% say a flu pandemic, 11% say workplace violence incident, and 58% say earthquake, hurricane, or tornado.
All right, very good. Thank you, Deb. Well, I think it's obvious there's a lot of people on the West Coast here, so that's why there was a significant number of people saying earthquake or hurricane or tornado. Obviously, there are a lot of factors that play a part in the ability for a company to recover from a disaster. And really, there's no right or wrong answers to this poll. Business survival could depend on the survival of key employees, recovery of business records and computer files, or the ability to recover quickly so competition doesn't take away all of your customers. I hope you'll see that it's important to plan for a disaster. So what happened in our hypothetical disaster? If the incident were an earthquake, this could be the situation. If it were a tornado or a hurricane, it could be something equally devastating. It is now 10 o'clock on August 28th, 2018. Today, you are responding to the consequences of the disaster. One problem is that many of the employees did not come to work today. Many employees' response or disaster plans list all of the things you need to do, but rarely do they take into consideration the impact of significant absenteeism and reduced work performance after disaster. Consider the first 4 bullets. 10% of the employees were injured, some seriously. 50% of the employees won't come to work for the next week. Some had family issues. Some were so affected by the disaster they just couldn't leave home. Some had to take care of their home. 90% of those employees who show up, including you, are distracted and non-productive. They want to work, but they just keep thinking about and worrying about the disaster. Several key members of your leadership team are out of contact, either because they were impacted by the disaster or out of town, or even out of the country. You'll note that, that your suppliers are also impacted by the disaster, and your customers need your products or services right away. You can see that disaster can really impact your company's ability to do business. Even if your business itself is not severely damaged, without your human capital, your company will not be able to meet the needs of your customers. It is now 10 a.m. Oops. Sorry, I got distracted. Do you think that your company could do a better job of business recovery if more employees were able to get back to real work? I hope you say yes. Once your employees return to work with clear heads, they will really help your business recover and move on. Point number 1, the more productive the employees are after disaster, the faster they, their families, and the business will recover. But you can't force them to be more productive after a disaster. They are a bit stressed out, confused, and conflicted. It's human nature. Maybe when robots take over, it'll be different, but for now, business will be impacted by humans responding to the disaster. How can you help this person? It may be that you can't at this point. The confusion, confliction, the stress will have to run its course. But what if you could back up before the disaster and help to prepare her for the disaster? Would that help? Yes. The best solution for being able to respond to a disaster is to be prepared for a disaster. We said that you might have 50% of your employees not returning to work. Just think if you could change that and have an absentee rate of only 10%. How much better would it be to have 40% of those show up non-productive instead of 90%. I think you would agree that this would help tremendously for the recovery of the business and to get some normal activities for the people. Is such a dream really possible after a disaster? People who are prepared for a disaster, and that's really prepared, not just pretending to be prepared, recover quicker after disaster. They knew the disaster could come, and their family is prepared, and it's easier to see over the disaster and back to normalcy. Disaster planning is important for individuals and companies. Simply stated, disaster planning includes pre-disaster actions, disaster response, and disaster recovery. The combination of those three activities is often called business continuity planning or disaster response recovery planning or continuity of operations planning. It doesn't really matter what it's called. Here's a polling question. Deb, over to you.
Okay, we're going to launch it. Do you know if your company has a business continuity plan? So yes, I don't know, or I don't think so. And so far we don't have any questions from the audience, which means you're doing a thorough job. So let's go ahead and encourage some questions here so that we can get some good dialogue going. We've got a good number of people voting. So 35% say yes, 34% say I don't know, and 33% don't think so.
Wow, that is a very equal results. Well, this graphic shows that you might have a better success in keeping your business in business after disaster if you've taken these steps. You start at the top with prevention, and then preparedness and testing before a disaster. And that would include communicating to the employees and letting them know that they have a disaster plan. Number two is response planning, planning how to respond during and immediately following a disaster. And three, recovery planning, planning on how to recover from the disaster. We realize that your business cannot devote a team of dozens of people to work full-time on disaster planning. However, there are things that can be done that are logical and simple that will help employees and the business. Let's briefly discuss the basis of these. First off, with prevention. In this use of the word prevention, we are discussing the reduction of risk to the business and employees before a disaster. Hazard identification and mitigation is a standard business practice in any company. Safety inspections or audits identify hazards such as OSHA regulation violations, fire code, and building code violations. It's just one more step to identify hazards associated with potential disasters and address them as well. For example, if you are in an earthquake country, you would want to remove heavy objects like trophies from a tall bookcase unless they and the bookcase are properly secured to the wall. In tornado country, you would want to have a safe place for people to go if a tornado is approaching. These actions fall into risk management. Each risk that you identify is managed with these four options. If you can avoid risk, that is the best option, but it's not always a logical option. The tornado risk can be avoided by just moving the business to another part of the country. But you can at least mitigate or reduce the risk by providing for warning systems and a secure place to protect people if a tornado pays a visit. Maybe one of the risks is your computer system and the important data it contains. You may not be able to avoid the risk of a computer loss, but you can mitigate the risk by relocating the computer to a safer spot at the site, or transferring the risk by arranging for a hot site or a warm site for a backup computer system, or having a contractor house your computer at their location in a more secure area. Sometimes you accept the risk because the risk probability is low or the business impact is low. You cannot prevent a natural disaster, but you can take measures to reduce the risks when a disaster occurs. In the last step, prevention, we identified the hazards and took actions on them where we could. With preparedness, we prepare for the disaster with additional actions. One great source for preparedness is ready.gov. They have selections that address business preparedness as well as individual and family preparedness. And it's free. Your business should have a simple but complete disaster response plan. I say simple because there are too many complicated disaster response plans in thick binders, collecting dust and being forgotten. Complete means you included the primary issues you need to deal with immediately after a disaster. I recommend the Business Continuity Planning Suite developed by the Department of Homeland Security's National Protection and Programs Directorate and FEMA. This software was created for any business with the need to create, improve, or update its business continuity plan. The suite is scalable for optimal use by organizations of any size and includes business continuity plan training and self-directed exercises for testing and implemented business continuity plan. Businesses can utilize this solution to maintain normal operations and provide resilience during a disruption. This is the first link. There are two other links that might be useful to you, including the one from the Small Business Agency. And your business will need to have a grasp on what business issues are critical to its recovery after disaster. That takes you to the business impact analysis. A business impact analysis is an evaluation of business functions and processes. It gathers information needed to develop strategies to reduce the consequences of a disaster. Sometimes the business impact analysis is done with a team approach so that all aspects of the function can be analyzed from the business's area point of view. You would normally see a representative from departments such as operations, HR, security, and procurement, but it all depends on the business. In an office environment, as many of you are in, you might have a team consisting of customer service, facilities, HR, and finance. Critical operations. If the business has critical functions that cannot easily be replicated or replaced, either internally or externally, then you need to plan for how you will recover those operations and how fast you can do so. Obviously, they are critical to the business, so the focus of business recovery will be on critical operations. This step is developing a plan so you can recover the critical operations as quickly and safely as possible in a priority fashion. Here's a story. A 40-employee business called Solutions Unlimited has a small machine shop and offers a complete solution for helping drain wine from wine barrels at just the right velocity. The solution is automatic and uses special software invented by the CEO to operate the product. What might Solutions Unlimited critical functions be? Well, they required me to black out the equipment because of the sensitive nature of this product. What's critical to this company's operations? Well, we have payroll. You have to pay your employees, so you need to have backup plans for that. Manufacturing, they use a one-of-a-kind special tool. They have specialized software to run the business and specialized software to support the product. They have one expert who knows the complete product and how it's made. The business impact analysis will identify and track solutions for the critical functions. Every business is different, but they all have critical functions. It'd be good for you to kind of identify to yourself what your business's critical functions are. Critical suppliers. If your business has critical suppliers, then that risk needs attention. If you can't find and arrange for secondary suppliers, then you need to determine what can be done to reduce that risk. Solutions Unlimited critical suppliers might be the tools and software they use to run the business, as well as the payroll process they contract out for. Do the critical suppliers have business continuity plans in place and tested? That would be good to know. Do they have critical suppliers, and do they have processes in place to protect against that risk? Next is critical customers. If you have multiple customers, it's appropriate to prioritize which is more critical. After a disaster, your out could be temporarily cut in half. Knowing which customers to focus on will help the critical customers get what they need. Yes, all customers think they are most important. Company leadership will need to know who gets the attention first. It could be because of a contract wording or needs of a government or other commitments to the customer. Critical jobs. Whether it's the company president or an IT or laser machine expert, others need to be knowledgeable so they can step in after disaster. Known as succession planning, critical jobs will still need to be done after the disaster. Sometimes the human aspect of a disaster event is left out of disaster planning, but just as important are the employees helping the business recover. We will cover each one of these separately. And sorry for all of the words on this slide. If policies and checklists can be developed in advance of a disaster, implementing these policies and using those checklists will be a lot easier after a disaster. Yes, there are a lot of them, but it's much easier to grab a policy after disaster than to try to fabricate one on the spot after disaster. And there's more. Please note that some of these policies are just a paragraph long, but difficult to design under disaster situations when you have lots of things going on. For very small companies, some of these issues will be minor and some will be critical. Besides policies, great tools to have at the ready are disaster checklists. Checklists will be an extremely important tool for those in business recovery. The first bullet links to one comprehensive checklist that's very appropriate and thorough. It queries the business after the disaster about insurance, cleaning, reestablishing the business, managing and paying staff, and planning for the future. Based on your online answers, it will provide a list of actions to help you. A great tool, especially if you have access to the internet after the disaster. And you can take advantage from that checklist and make your own based on your business in advance of a disaster. A simple disaster checklist can be tailored from your disaster policy, allowing for pre-drafted priority actions so that key activities are not forgotten. Each support organization will benefit with a disaster checklist. Supplies. Disaster supplies at a business is a delicate matter. You can't maintain a huge warehouse of food, water, cots, etc. for your employees unless you are a place like Walmart or Costco or maybe a faith-based organization. If you develop a preparedness culture in your business, that will help a great deal. Employees will have supplies in their cars, so no matter where they are, when a disaster strikes, they are prepared. A business can have some supplies available. Many already do in the form of bottled water, vending machines, and first aid kits. If you have floor wardens for fire drills, those might be the right candidates for a disaster kit that includes first aid, water, walkie-talkies, etc. Employees are the key to keeping the business and to helping the business recover. In the last slide, I mentioned individual preparedness culture. Most people won't prepare for a disaster without a combination of education, peer support, and role models doing it first. It is probably human nature to think that a disaster won't happen to them. A business can help employees prepare with disaster preparedness campaign that could include preparedness fair, lunchtime activities, and supporting regional, city, and national preparedness events. Many places have a shakeout operation towards October, November, such as Shakeout San Diego, Shakeout California. Those are good things to connect with. It doesn't have to cost much to run the campaign. What is important is sincere commitment by the business about preparedness. Obviously, if the leadership team is visibly supportive of the preparedness activities, it will make it easier to implement disaster policies, influence a preparedness culture, and the acquisition of preparedness supplies. The best solution for being able to respond for a disaster is to be prepared for that disaster. The disaster supply kit will be discussed in depth shortly, but I want to discuss what I feel is the most important piece of preparedness. My goal for you today, to take at least one thing from this presentation and act on it this week. Doing one thing will help you develop your internal preparedness culture. This week, not next week, today would be even better. Deborah, over to you.
All right, so I will launch the next polling question. In a disaster, what is the most important thing to have available? Is it contact information for all family members, water, first aid kit, toolkit and cash, or internet access? I think that says took kit and it's supposed to be toolkit. So I don't know what happened there.
Whoops.
But
Yep, it is a toolkit.
Toolkit. And just to let everyone know, we will be sending out all of the information for how to access these materials after the webinar. So I know Ed is giving a lot of really great resources. So you'll be able to have access to those resources and we will send them out. All right. Still waiting for a few people to vote, but we got a good number, so we'll go ahead. 22% say contact information for all family members, 50% say water, 25% say the first aid kit, 1% say a toolkit and cash, and 1% say internet access.
Well, that's good. I'm glad people aren't focusing on the internet after disaster because it will be too late to start planning at that point. All right, number one thing to have for disaster. Google, no. Text messaging, no. Whiskey, no. Clothes, well, maybe. YouTube, no, but the family disaster plan, not yet. Number one thing to have for disaster is water. Why water? We need water even more than instant messaging. And you would all make my day if 100% of you would take steps to have water ready for a disaster. Basically, in a disaster, water is going to help you survive. How much water do you need for disaster for a family of 3 with a large dog? Polling question number 5.
Okay, so select one. It's either going to be 10 gallons, 15 gallons, 20 gallons, or 50 gallons. Okay, and please feel free to use your chat box or questions box to ask me any questions along the way. We will work those into the presentation. Okay, we've got a great number of people voting this time. So 6% say 10 gallons, 14% say 15 gallons, 39% say 20 gallons, and 40% say 50 gallons.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for participating in this poll. Taking into consideration, we don't know what the disaster is going to be in advance most of the time, and we don't know how many people will be in your house when the disaster strikes. We recommend a gallon per day per person for 2 weeks. It used to be, they used to say water for 3 days, but in a real disaster, there's a really good chance you won't have water for 3 days, and it will really reduce the effectiveness of the response people if everybody needs water after 3 days. So add in a thirsty dog, and all that comes to about 50 gallons. So you'll need water supplies in case of a disaster situation. At home, as we mentioned, 1 gallon per person per day for 2 weeks. In all cars, maybe a gallon of water. And by the way, plastic is okay in cars. There's an internet thing that says the plastic's not good, but that's not the case. And it'll be useful having water at work. Let's talk about water at home. When we said 50 gallons, I felt all of you figuring out how you could store 50 gallons of water at your place. If you need 2 weeks of water, drinking water, and you need 50 gallons, many of you have a water heater tank. That is a very good source of drinkable water because it's always being replaced with fresh water. So if you have a water heater, that is a perfect source of your 50 or so gallons, as long as it doesn't get contaminated after the disaster. So you'd want to probably turn off the water incoming into your water tank in the event of a major earthquake or other similar disaster. Plan B is a stockpile of drinking water just in case something happens to your tank, and just as a backup. Maybe you don't have access to the tank after a disaster. It'd be good to have a stockpile of some drinking water and replace that every couple of years. There are many stores that sell 2-gallon water bottles or 1-gallon water bottles, and you may want to have a few cases of those in a particular place. And finally, you can always fill a bathtub if you don't have enough drinking water. There's something that serves as a bladder inside a bathtub that you can fill up after disaster. And I put a connection to a link for something called a water bob. That's available for purchase. I think it's around $25. I think I need to update my slide there, but it's another source of water. A plan D is a filter water from rain barrels if you ever get rain, and other sources of water. Except for pool water, most experts say don't drink pool water because to use it only for cleaning and flushing toilets, unless you distill it. And that's because the salts in the water get more and more concentrated as you replenish fresh water into your pool, and it can cause kidney damage if you drink it very much. And one thing is you can set reminders in your computer calendar to replace water. And please remember where your water filter is in case you do need to filter water from rain barrels and other sources. Once you have water preparations for your home and for your car, the next steps would be to develop a family preparedness plan, and there's a free one available at the site that I've shown here. And with that, you get your family involved so they can be confident and they can take appropriate actions even if you're not there when the disaster occurs. You can use the list from ready.gov. This has personal preparedness, so the cost for this personal preparedness process would be a little less than $100. And you're going to have all the supplies you need to help survive a disaster and not be a burden to services and neighbors. As I mentioned, a preparedness culture. The more a company shares a preparedness culture with all of its employees, especially from top leadership down, the greater chances it will survive a disaster. If only one person in the company is prepared, it won't help much with business and employee recovery. But if the company culture is to promote preparedness and recognize the importance of preparing, that preparedness culture will become commonplace and very natural. What have we discussed so far? The more productive the employees are after disaster, the faster they will recover, their families will recover, and the business will recover. But if you can't force them to be more productive after a disaster, the solution is to get people more prepared and their families more prepared. It will be much easier to recover from the disaster. Point 2, a preparedness culture in a company helps to engage employees towards being prepared. And if everyone is prepared, the synergy is quite beneficial for the community and the business. Earlier, we discussed our mock disaster that occurred yesterday. Besides people not being prepared and therefore distracted, confused, and conflicted, there will be other issues. As we mentioned, several key members of your leadership team are out of contact. Your suppliers were also impacted by the disaster. Your customers need your products or services right away. Once you have the plan, you need to see if the plan will work, hopefully before disaster really occurs. Can you properly support your customers after disaster? Better test the plan. Testing the preparedness program helps to fix gaps and to train team members to perform their roles. There are several different types of exercises. Some of the tests are simple, involve a lot of people, like a fire drill, and some involve just a few people, like a tabletop exercise. The tests can be customized to focus on your critical processes, such as computer systems and business records. For more information, you can go to ready.gov. They have examples. And response. Every disaster is different, but responding in a disaster uses the same initial actions. Engage your brain, take a breath, use your brain. The actions taken in the initial minutes of a disaster are critical. A prompt warning to employees to evacuate, shelter, or lock down can save lives. There are right things to do in a disaster and the other things. For example, in earthquake country, we know to get under something sturdy and hold on. It is still a natural response to run outside the building, but there's a higher risk of injury doing so. The information employees receive from the business will help them know what to do when the disaster occurs. So go to ready.gov for more information. Almost done. And I got off track there for a second. I apologize. After the disaster, the business needs to recover. Recovering operations, including computer systems, and recover customer confidence. Recovery might include relocating the business, expensive repair operations, using mutual aid agreements, getting new suppliers, the list goes on. Your business continuity plan will guide you. After recovery, it's time to use the experience to improve the plan for next time. In our mock disaster, you and everyone else did what they could after the mock disaster occurred last night. You decided on the immediate actions to take. We said we would discuss the details of those actions towards the end of the webinar. Here we are. Yesterday was newsworthy. Throughout the U.S., there were severe earthquakes causing damage across the land. Lucky for us, our companies had recently sent out a letter to all employees with the following message, and Deb is going to read it to you.
From the company president. Fellow employees, as you know, our business believes in preparedness, and I believe in preparedness. You have all seen photos on our Facebook account showing my water supplies in my car and house. You never know when you will need those water supplies. Congratulations to all of you who have prepared the same way. Maybe our city experiences a flood and drinking water is limited. With you and your 14 days of water, you will be able to live without assistance from emergency services. After all, they will be quite busy. Or maybe you will be on a driving vacation to California and they have a catastrophic earthquake. You will be as ready as you can be with your water and food supplies in your car. Speaking of earthquakes, because of the recent quake activity in various parts of the U.S., I thought I would share an earthquake response checklist that I got from a friend in California. It has useful information that applies to most disasters. Thanks again for being a part of our preparedness campaign. Signed, the President.
Doesn't that sound good? If you were an employee of a company who's the president or the leaders sent out this, it would help to instill a preparedness culture because everybody is getting involved. It's a really a great process to take. I've included the earthquake response checklist. We're not going to talk about it at this point. It was perfect timing for the president to send out this a few weeks ago. On day 2, you got your family together. They were fine. You decided to go into work and help activate the company's business continuity plan. Your assignment here for this process is to have a sufficient supplies of water at home and cars, and to have a nice day. The floods caused some damage. The floods caused some damage to all your homes, even yours. So you had to have your water, and you were happy that you did. Well, I apologize for the technical difficulties, and I may have ran through this presentation faster because of that. And we have time for some questions.
All right, Ed. So we have a question about the plastic water bottles in the car. There's been a lot of discussion about that plastic water bottles may cause the toxins in the plastic to come out. You said you have new information about that. Can you give us a little bit more information?
Well, it's difficult to fight the internet when it comes out with different philosophies. There really hasn't been any documented evidence that that is actually the case. Plastic bottles may taste a little bad after 2 years, but after 2 years in a car, it's probably time to change them anyway because they're going to be fragile and start leaking. So besides putting these plastic bottles in a secondary container, such as a plastic container you can buy at any of the local stores, I change the water every couple of years. There is a date on all plastic water bottles, and they do tell you when it's time to replace them. And that is because the plastic starts decaying. But I've not been able to find any evidence of contamination causing health risks for drinking bottled water that's been in the car. A similar case has to do with that internet fallacy of a triangle of safety, the area of safety for an earthquake, where someone came out and said that you shouldn't be under something sturdy, you should sit next to it during an earthquake. And that is shown to be wrong if you live in areas where you don't have rock houses. It's much better to be under something sturdy. If something falls down from the ceiling, the shock, the impact is going to be absorbed by the item that you're under instead of you. So that's another thing off the internet that we just need to remember. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. And what is the best policy in case of workplace violence?
Is workplace violence associated with a disaster?
Mm-hmm. Well, workplace violence is a disaster. So what are some of the policies that go along with that?
That's a good question, and let me try to segue over from the natural disaster to the workplace issues. Boy, that's a good question. I'm going to have to look into that to come up with that.
I think we actually do have a workplace violence webinar series that, that's probably a 1-hour response behind that question.
No, but it is a valid question because all of these things are really going to result in a disaster. If it's a shooter, active shooter in your office, and person's after even their spouse, it's going to cause a disaster. And That requires some good planning in advance so that you do everything you can to protect yourself. I recently went to a conference about the contractors who rebuilt the Sandy Hook school and after their violent attack. And they really did make some great improvements to the layout, to the design, to reduce the risk of a repeat situation like that. So it is planning on how you're going to protect the employees is a part of the security plan as well. Do you have any easier questions, Deb?
Well, we'll see here. During a tornado, is it always safer to find an underground basement, or is there other locations you recommend?
Good question. And what we find in disasters is there's no perfect solution for anything. Some people are saved when they go under a bridge on the freeway, and other people are sucked out because they're in a bridge and a freeway. So I think a lot of times you have to figure out what is the highest likelihood of a low risk. And normally a basement or some sort of a tornado shelter is the lowest risk. If you don't, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's equate that to now a hurricane, or I'm sorry, a hurricane. During a hurricane, is it safer to travel to a safer location or ride out the storm?
See, and really, it is all risk analysis. And some people take on the risk of staying in place, like what they were forced to do in Hawaii, because there wasn't enough places for them to go to seek shelter. But then again, it depends on your location and severity of the storm and the risk of flooding instead of just strong winds. And I think I would rely on the local emergency services people, because they will have a greater concept on evacuation and whether you should evacuate or should remain in place or what. The same thing applies to wildfires. There was a philosophy at one time where people were saying, well, it's better to stay in your house during a wildfire than to try to escape. And then when the fire goes past you, you can put out the fire if the fire is on your roof. Well, that also didn't work for people. So it's a risk analysis, and rely on your local emergency services organizations.
Okay. And Ed, you had mentioned about having cash in your preparedness kit. How much do you recommend?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on what it is you're going to be buying with that cash. You can assume that there won't be any ATMs running if there's a power failure, and in many disasters there will be no power. So I wouldn't have thousands of dollars under my mattress, but I would probably have maybe $100 in singles somewhere secure, and $100 isn't that much. But if you need to buy some food from a nearby vendor and they do not have change, it'd be just better to have some singles, and now would be a better time to get change like that than to wait until after a disaster.
Got it. All right, so that completes our questions. I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar presented by Heffernan. We will send information by email with instructions on how to access a copy of the presentation on our website. Thank you, Ed Langmaid, for your time and expertise today. We hope all of the attendees found today's webinar to be a valuable use of your time. Please be sure to join us on September 18th for payroll practices, records, and outsourcing. Thank you very much, and have a safe day.